The Duchess rides to the hunt on a white palfrey. He wears a quilted purpoint of white or grey silk over a white linen shirt, cord breeches and arming boots with points for his sabatons. The only weapon he carries is a slightly curved, single-edged hanger, as long as his arm from shoulder to fingertips. He may wear a hat, if rain is actually falling. He is followed by 4 huntsmen on barbs or jennets, who carry his armor, his great spear, his light spears, his bow, and his close sword, which can be either a falchion or a tuck, depending on the likely quarry. A page on an ambler or a mule follows with the wet weather gear, a hooded mantle, a surcoat, chaps and spats, and the horn. On arriving at the meet, the Duchess dismounts and is accomplished for the hunt in the following order, which differs slightly from the proper order for war. First, the sabatons laced tightly at the toes and under the instep. Next, the greaves, followed by the leg harness of demigreaves, polaines, and cuisses. Gamboised cuisses are considered excessive, except where the quarry is exclusively bear or wolf. These are secured by points to the hem of the pourpoint, and the usual straps and buckles around the thigh, the calf, and the inside of the knee. Since the cuirass and the placket are not worn for the hunt, the upper points are secured to the kidney belt, after which the falds are added to protect the buttocks, thighs, and groin. The arm harness is fitted next. In the hunting harness, the vambrace is close to the outside of the forearm with buckles, and the half-rear brace is worn, secured at the shoulder with a single point. Spodlers are preferred to pauldrons for protection of the shoulder, and a simple one-lame gorget suffices for the neck. Finally, the Duchess puts on his gauntlets. The finger type is preferred to the clamshell or mitten varieties, and his baldric, from which hang his close sword and his horn. He carries his great spear in his right hand. The 4 huntsmen carry the rest of the gear between them. The page stays behind at the meet to hold the horses. Meal couldn't stop yawning. He'd gone to bed early and slept well, in spite of which he'd woken up with a slight headache in his temples just behind his eyes. If it hadn't been for the fact that this was Orsi's special treat and Beatrice had asked him to go, he'd have stayed in bed. The sky was black with a few silver cracks, and he could smell rain in the air. The Duchess never takes any notice of the weather, in the same way as a king can decline to recognize a government of which he doesn't approve. Accordingly, he was bareheaded, and the damp made his head throb. A day or so before, Jarnac had muttered something about working down the high pastures in the hope of fleshing a good boar into the open. That meant a lot of walking, most of it uphill. What joy! Long practice made it possible for him to greet his fellow hunters with a reasonable show of affability in spite of the pain behind his eyes. Jarnac hadn't arrived yet, of course, neither had Orsi, who had to make his entrance immediately after his host. Meal looked round for unfamiliar faces. A thin, spotty young man with the unfortunate Poliorcetes nose, 2 possible candidates, Gatcher or Dester. He hadn't seen either of them for 5 years. A stout, flat-faced man in the Focus livery. He'd heard someone say that old Eston had retired and his son had taken over as whipper-in for the Focus pack. Everyone else he knew, including, he frowned, a dark-skinned man shorter than everyone else, unarmored, and carrying a long cloth bag made of sacking. "Hello," Meal said, squeezing out a little more affability from somewhere. "I'd forgotten. Jarnac mentioned you were coming along today." Ziani Vaatzis turned his head and looked at him for a heartbeat before answering. "I'm afraid I sort of bullied him into inviting me," he said, "only I've never seen anything like this before." Meal smiled. "Anyone who can bully Jarnac has my sincere admiration," he said. "I'd have thought it couldn't be done. So, what do you make of it all?" "Impressive," Vaatzid replied. Not that it mattered, since Meal wasn't particularly interested in the truth. "I had no idea it would be so formal. I expect I look ridiculous." "Not at all," said Meal. Well, it wasn't a good day for truth generally. "What have you got there in the bag?" Vaatzid looked sheepish. "I didn't know what to bring, so I fetched along my bow. I hope that's all right." "Very good," Meal said. "Is it the one you made yourself?" he added, as a way of filling the silence. Vaatzid nodded, loosed the knot, and pulled something out of the bag. It would have looked quite like a bow if it hadn't been made of metal. He was holding it out for Meal to examine, like a cat that insists on bringing small dead birds into the house. "Steel?" Meal guessed. Actually, he was impressed. It was very light and thin, but extremely stiff. Hard to guess the draw weight while it was unstrung, but Meal figured something around 80 to 85 pounds. Vaatzis nodded again, as Meal noticed the groove stamped down the middle. Clever, it added strength while conserving mass, like the fuller in a sword blade. "I've never seen a bow like this before," Meal said. Boatsy shrugged. "It's the standard pattern back home," he said. Meal guessed from a slight trace of color in his voice that he was lying, but he couldn't imagine why. A clatter of hoofs and the yapping of dogs announced the arrival of Jarnac. He looked tired, tense, if possible even larger than usual. As master, he was wearing his surcoat over his armor, so that everybody would be able to recognize him even at a distance. Today, only today, he could wear the duckus arms proper, free from the quarterings of the cadet branch. Somehow they seemed to sit more naturally on Jarnac's massive chest than they'd ever done on Meal. Life is crammed with little ironies, if you know where to look. It was probably Meal's imagination, but he thought he noticed Boatsy's flinch a little when he saw Jarnac on his horse, and maybe he relaxed a bit when he dismounted. To business straight away. On his own ground, Jarnac could explain a complicated plan of action clearly and quickly. The basic idea was to get up to the high pasture to the west of the big wood, approach downwind from the east while the dew was still on the grass, in hopes of putting up one of a group of 4 particularly fine mature boars that had been consistently sighted in the area over the last 10 days. Normally they had stayed in the wood during the hours of daylight, but there was a chance of catching them out at this time of year, when dawn came early and the wet, lush grass was particularly tempting. Being realistic, they had precious little chance of bringing a boar to bay in the pasture, even if they put one up there. They'd have to follow it into the wood and drive it out the other side, down into the river ideally, but at least there would be a clear scent for the dogs to follow, which would save the uncertainty and frustration of crashing about in the underwood, hoping they'd be lucky enough to tread on one's tail, which was the only sure way of finding a boar in deep cover. If they drew a blank in the pasture, they'd have to fall back on it anyway, but the result as far as the standing party was concerned would be more or less the same. Wherever they found it, Jarnac and the hounds would be looking to drive the boar through the wood, east-west, down the hill, aiming to bring it to bay either in the river or in the firs on the far bank. The standing party, accordingly, should make its way up the old carter's drove until they drew level with the lower edge of the wood. They should then follow the edge round, making as little noise as possible, and the line out in a circle on the southwestern side, 25 yards inside the wood, 10 yards apart. No shots to be taken eastward, of course, for fear of the arrow skipping on a branch and hitting the beaters or the dogs. 1 horn call meant the boar was in sight, 2 if it was on the move, 3 for at bay, 4 for death, 5 to signal mortal peril requiring immediate assistance. And had everybody brought a horn? Meal nudged Ziani in the ribs. "No," Ziani said, his voice rather squeaky. "Sorry, I didn't realize." Someone handed him one. "Do you know how to sound it?" Jarnac asked. "In that case, you'd better have a practice now. Doesn't matter a damn if it sounds like a mule farting, but it's essential everyone knows where everybody else is. Otherwise, things can go wrong very quickly." That was exactly what it sounded like. But after 4 tries, Jarnac nodded and said, "That'll do," and Ziani was able to sink back into the obscurity of the circle. The huntsmen were starting to collect the dogs, while the pages led the horses away to wooden mangers filled with oats. Ziani remembered that he'd forgotten to bring the last pieces of armor, but either Jarnac had forgotten too, or he had other things on his mind. The beating party was almost ready to leave. Ziani noticed that Meal Duckus was still standing next to him. Odd, because he'd have thought that the Duckus would be circulating, chatting to his fellow nobles. Then he realized. Good manners ordained that, since Ziani was a stranger and didn't know anybody else there, Meal had to stay with him and put him at ease. For a moment he was touched, but the Duckus is considerate of his inferiors in the same way a cat slashes at trailing string, because instinct gives him no choice. "Where's the Duke?" he asked. "They aren't going to leave without him, are they?" Meal grinned. "Not likely, but it's not polite for the guest of honor to be there for the briefing. Don't ask me why, it's just one of those things. He shows up, well, any minute now, and I fill him in on the plan of the campaign." Ziani was about to ask, "Why you?" but he guessed it in time. Meal was senior nobleman in the standing party, so passing on the master's orders was his job. Come to think of it, there had been something about it in one of the books. Orsi arrived at last. His clothes, armor, and escort had been set down immediately by king fashion back when the Mezentines were still living in the old country. But the Duke of Aremia Montis traditionally defied tradition when hunting informally with close friends. Accordingly, he was wearing an old comfortable arming coat under distinctly scruffy leathers, and had his hat on even though it wasn't raining. He looked more cheerful than Meal could remember seeing him since before the Mezentine expedition. Beatrice was with him. But she didn't dismount when he did. She leaned forward in the saddle to kiss him, then pulled her horse's head around and rode back down the path. Orsi turned back to watch her go, then strode forward to greet Meal. "Don't tell me," he said. "Jarnac's found us a pig the size of an ox with tusks like parsnips, and it's sitting waiting for us just over there in the bushes." "In a sense," Meal replied. "There's supposed to be 6 feeding the fat grass up top, and the idea is to pick them up in the open and drive them out through the wood and through the other side." He shrugged. Don't quite see it myself, but Jarnak's the expert, or so he keeps telling me. Orsi grinned. That's your cousin for you, he said. I remember one time we were out after geese years ago, and he'd cooked up this incredibly elaborate plan, whereby the geese came in here, saw the decoys, turned through 65 degrees over one hide, got shot at, turned another 32 degrees, which took them over the other hide, and so on. Absolutely crazy, the whole thing, and everybody was saying, bloody Jarnak, why can't he keep it simple? Except it worked, and we got 27 geese in one night. He shrugged. Disastrous, of course, he went on, because after that, every time Jarnak said the geese were coming in on the stubbles and he had a clever plan, we all trudged out over the mud flats and sat in flooded ditches half the night expecting another miracle, and of course we'd have seen more geese staying at home and hiding in the clothes press. Meal smiled broadly. He'd heard the story many times before, and it had been much closer to truth the first time, but it pleased him to see his friend happy, though of course the reason for it was nothing to do with the prospects for the day's hunt or fresh air or anything like that. He was happy because Beatrice had come out to meet with him, because Orsi loved Beatrice more than anything else in the wood. More than being Duke, more than anything. One more thing he had in common with his old friend, his liege lord. How it had come about that he'd managed to persuade himself that she didn't love him, Meal couldn't say, but it was obvious to everyone but Orsi and possibly Beatrice herself. He wished for a variety of reasons that she hadn't gone straight back home just now. She sat down on the slim, brittle-looking chair and opened her writing box. As she took out the ink bottle, she hesitated and scowled. Then she stood up, went to the door, and wedged it shut with the handle of a broom some maid had carelessly left behind. Pen, ink, and the little square of scraped parchment. She'd cut it from the inside of the binding of a book, and cleaned it up herself with pumice. Maybe she'd been a bit too enthusiastic about it. There were a few places where she'd scrubbed it too thin and made a small hole, or else worn it down into the soft inside so that any ink applied there would soak away into the fibers and make a ghastly mess. Beatrice Siripati to Valens Valentinianus greetings. Orsi, she thought. She hoped he was having a wonderful day. For a moment or so she'd persuaded herself that she'd go with him, at least for the morning. If they'd been hunting Parforce, and she could have ridden instead of walking, probably she would have stayed, but she'd never liked walking much, especially not up hills or through dense tangled forests. Besides, if she'd gone, she'd probably have spoiled the day for him. He'd have to hang back with her, being thoughtful and considerate, when really he wanted to be up at the front with the harborers or crouched in the underbrush waiting to shoot. You never replied to my last letter. I suppose there could be several different reasons. I offended you. I was putting pressure on you, breaking the rules of our friendship. I brought Orsi into it, when this just happens to be between you and me. Or perhaps you're just tired of me and bored by my letters. If it's any of those, I'd understand. Going too far, that's always been my biggest failing. Well, if I've offended you, I'm sorry. I'm not going to plead or anything. If you can forgive me, please do. If not, well, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I don't have the heart to continue this. I don't care about these people. They aren't even real. And their dramas. Drama. Drama.